Caro Verbeek, born in 1980, is an art historian, author, and researcher with a focus on, and that brings us to the presentation of Eva, a focus on the lower senses. Her aim is to construct or to reconstruct a more sensory history of art by collecting and creating historical sense and tactile impressions. She teaches the preliminary course, The Other Senses, at the Royal Academy of Arts in The Hague, and creates olfactory tours for museums. She has published of kinesthesia, olfactory, and tactile art, and has lectured widely on these subjects. She has worked at the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam and is now affiliated with the Rijksmuseum Amsterdam. And we are very happy to have Caro here, and Caro will talk today about the inhaling history of art on the role of olfaction during the Avant-Garde.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I just distributed a smell, and your only task now is to smell and to associate it with a color. What color comes to mind? And don't tell me anything. At the end of the lecture, I will ask you. It appears that, well, among my students, almost 90% perceive this smell as the same, more or less same color. We talked a lot about vision, we talked about tactility. Today I want to talk about olfactory art. Olfactory is the adjective for smell. Some people think, why is this woman always talking about old factories? But olfactory means smell. In a panel about visual art, we talk about artivisieve, visual arts, beeldende kunst in Dutch. But history of art is not just about seeing. We are educated to use our eyes when it comes to history of art, sometimes also sound, but we forget that smell played a really important role during the avant-garde. It plays a really important role now. There was an artist here, Barbara Ryan, at Art Laboratory, who used smells. And I brought some of her smells. And I want to confront the way smell is used now to the way smell was used more than, or almost 100 years ago. And I have 3 historical case studies. A futurist one, a Dadaist one, and a Surrealist one. And we'll talk about that after I discuss Barbara Ryan's work a bit more. And why the night watch? I work at the Rijksmuseum, and I work at the Department of Prints and Drawings. But because I always talk about smell, they found out that I have a passion for smell. So I organized a museum night. I think it exists here too in Berlin, with smells inspired by paintings. They were made by a senior perfumer, these scents. And they are not literal smells. No, they're translations of the contrasts and colors. And I brought the smell of the night watch. Maybe you can pass it on in one inhalation. Give other people a chance to smell it too. And This smell is a chiaroscuro smell, dark and light. Dark and light is universal for all the senses. And in smell, it are those dark amber notes in contrast with really light lily of the valley notes. When you smell it and look at the painting, you can inhale this painting. And this camera over here cannot record this smell. That's also the power of smell. It's unique. You need to be present. It's about vicinity. And the reason I got to know Barbara Ryan is because we started to discuss, while chatting on Facebook, the smell of this painting. That's how we got to know each other, on Facebook. And she described the smell as well. Here it is. She said, I think the night watch must contain benzoin, frankincense, and possibly galbanum. It's all in there. There are so many gold notes. Benzoin and frankincense produce an amber gilt color, similar to the main figure's hair or beard, and the girl on the left's hair. But it needs more brightening. So she's thinking about how can I make this smell even brighter. Barbara Ryan is a synesthete, but this smell of the night watch was made by a perfumer. And actually in the perfume industry there is an incredible amount of research into color, smell, synesthesia, but of course they hide all these results because of the competition. And they have asked hundreds of people, okay, smell this, what color do you see? And that information was used to translate this painting into a smell. Here we see Barbara Ryan at Art Laboratory. And as Regine told us yesterday, she remapped Berlin according to her polymodal synesthesia between structure, smell, a sense of place, time. But she recreated literal smells of Berlin that do have a color and a structure to her. And actually this mapping of cities is one of the main currents now in olfactory art. Most artists that use smell are mapping cities. I think because you can look up pictures on the internet of cities, hear sounds, but you cannot send an email with the smell of a city. In this digital age, smell is becoming more and more important and popular. And Barbara Ryan, when she lived here in the 90s, she sensed a particular difference between East and West Berlin. There was a different smell between East and West Berlin. That's what Barbara Ryan said. And I found the smells in East Berlin much more interesting, much less superficial. History hadn't been painted over. And she especially liked Alexanderplatz. These are the titles of the smells that she made. I won't pass them around, but if you're curious, you can come over after the lectures in the break and I can show them to you, those smells. And this I'm showing you because it made me think about art in relation to smell. It was the first work of art I ever smelled. It was at the Biennale di Venezia. I went there, I smelled something, it annoyed me, it irritated me. I thought, why didn't they get rid of this smell? It's an exhibition. What happened in the kitchen? And hundreds of meters ahead, I saw that the smell was part of a work of art. And at that time, I was writing my master's thesis. And I thought, okay, I'm an art historian. I have no idea how to deal with this. How am I supposed to look at this work of art? So I decided to write my master's thesis on olfactory art, contemporary olfactory art. And it smelled of turmeric, clove, very spicy, oriental. And it's a landscape that is an olfactory landscape that is much bigger than what you actually see. It's uncontrollable. That's also why it's not very popular with many curators. Last example, the second theme, beside mapping cities, is body odor, or talking about taboos. We are not born to dislike body odors. It's a taboo that's about 150 years old. Peter de Cupere ordered 5 dancers to wear these rubber suits, dance and sweat. But the night before, he cooked each single one of these dancers a different meal, so they would all smell differently. He then collected the sweat, he put it in one jar and synthesized it. And that was an olfactory documentation of this dance. I didn't bring it, I have it. It's very special, I can tell you. And then going back in time to the Avant-Garde. We heard about the Gesamtkunstwerk, total work of art, yesterday. I will start reading my paper. Artists started displaying a great interest in olfaction, both in theory and practice, out in the open and sometimes behind closed doors of their studio at the beginning of the 20th century. And what I would like to talk about here today is in which ways did artists start to incorporate smell and why? But I will first briefly describe the developments leading to a more sensory history of art, focusing on olfaction. The preoccupation of artists with the lower or other senses, as it has been called for hundreds of years, smell, taste, touch, proprioception. The preoccupation of artists with the lower or other senses appears to be a reaction to the 19th century attitude that ranked the 5 common senses in a strict hierarchy. Avant-garde groups were strongly opposed to this concept rooted in antiquity, in which the eye and the ear dominated all the other senses. And they even sought to undermine this idea. The concept of the Gesamtkunstwerk, later associated to Richard Wagner, was the start of this development. In 1849, Wagner introduced this idea of a total work of art in which various disciplines like dance, music, and stage design were intended to merge equally and harmoniously, transforming a traditional idea of the opera. It was a response to the romantic idea that all the arts and their affiliated senses, like music to the ear and painting to the eye, were to be neatly separated, executed, and studied. Even though the Gesamtkunstwerk brought into existence a more interdisciplinary, a more sensory type of art, it was the upcoming notion of synesthesia that really opened the door for the lower senses. Before the turn of the century, scientists and artists were intrigued by pinpointing correspondences between all the senses, especially sight, sound, and smell. Septimus Piesse was even obsessed by it. He created a system in which every sense corresponds to a musical note. And I have that here. It's difficult to see. But there are octaves of odors. All the animal notes are in octaves, for example. Other artists followed by conveying several senses through one sensuous realm. For instance, the composer Debussy tried to express the smell of a dark alley in Les Parfums de la Nuit. In his music, Baudelaire argued for a synthesis of colors, sounds, and perfumes with words in his poem Correspondences. And Cézanne presented a multisensory atmosphere through painting. One was to smell, hear, and see the Mont Saint-Victoire simply by looking at it. So one modality causes several sensory stimuli. And what the French symbolist referred to as audition colorée is now labeled synesthesia. And we heard several definitions. I have one definition by Chrétien van Kampen here. Synesthesia is a neurological condition in which a stimulus, usually perceived by one sense, is simultaneously experienced by another. Of course, one of the most famous synesthetes of all times is Wassily Kandinsky. And he was not just said to pair music and vision, or sight and hearing, but also smells and shapes. It's only one line in Über das Geistige in der Kunst, but he says it. Barbara Ryan commented on Kandinsky in another chat we had. The Kandinsky piece that she saw in a museum was like someone speaking in a language that was complete with the right tones and sound, the right smells and physical sensations. It contained an infinite amount of information, but could be processed almost instantly. So to Barbara Ryan, Kandinsky also has a smell. Especially the futurists drew inspiration from this heritage, since they advocated a fusion between life and art. All the senses had to be engaged, and synesthesia seemed to be a proper tool to establish this. In 1913, this uncommon sensory condition played a role in two futurist manifestos. Cara's, the painting of sound, noise, and odors. There's a difference between sound and noise. And Prampolini's chromophony, the color of sounds. Cara makes references to smells in relation to colors, and he treats them as analogous to sounds. Beginning of quote. While the sounds, noises, and smells of animals are yellow and blue, those of a woman are green, blue, and purple. End of quote. One of the fragments of the Manifesto. And another really nice one. We futurists therefore claim that in bringing the elements of sound, noise, and smell to painting, we are opening fresh paths, destroying the stupid passion for values which are solemn, academic, serene, heretic, and mummified. Everything purely intellectual, in fact. This is interesting because the lower senses, smell, taste, touch, are anti-intellectual. When you smell something, it's very difficult to step back from the object and contemplate, as we can do with visual objects and when we hear something. No, when you smell, it's there, the reaction is there before you have time to process it, before you can think about it. That is also why smell was excluded from the aesthetic debate. It was considered animalistic, erotic by these philosophers. And it was impossible to contemplate. And aesthetics need contemplation, according to Kant and Hegel. There was a contemporary interest in the senses from the field of education. The founder of a sensory education system, Maria Montessori, believed that there is nothing in the intellect which does not exist in the senses first. She developed games for children to enhance their sensory capacities. The futurist got acquainted with her practices through Marinetti's wife, Benedetta Kappa. Her influence is undeniably present in Balla and Depro's multisensory odoriferous toys, so toys with a smell, which they described in 1915 in the Manifesto Ricostruzione Futurista dell'Universo. Even though these artists treated olfaction as an important theme in their theories, it was still through the mediation of the eye, often, and ear, that smells and other sensory experiences were evoked. And that changed with this manifesto, which was found in Giacomo Balla's studio after his death, Arte degli Odori, the art of smells. We all know Giacomo Balla for his famous painting, Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash. Oh, it's not here. And I got this really interesting quote. Can I take it out? No. Okay. Then I'll just stand like this. Despite the enormous wealth of olfactory sensations, their marvelous variety, and the depth of the impression sense will always have on people of all races and of all times, despite the fact that some perfumes are more refined than simple or polyphonic musical impressions, and the shouting impressions of malodors are more powerful than cacophonous discourse, still no one so far ever thought of a general application of olfactory sensations to enhance visual and auditory sensations in art before, and consequently of an authentic art of sense. It was very important for the futurists to come with new concepts. And in fact, he was the first. Unfortunately, it was never published during his life. There was a manifest on taste, there was a manifest on touch, but this manifest on smell somehow never surfaced during his life, which is a shame. Balla pleads for a new type of art in which the development of the sense of smell is essential and in which scents play a major role in public life. An interesting aspect, which makes him different from the perfume industry, is the importance of a specific type of smell which is often excluded. Beginning of quote. The entire olfactory lyricism in nature doesn't just reside in perfumes. It's also in the stench, in the malodorous. Strikingly, end of quote. Strikingly, more than a century before, philosopher Edmund Burke gave stench a moderate place in the 18th century aesthetic debate, whereas Kant and Hegel completely excluded the sense of smell because of its animalistic nature. He argued that through stench one could experience the sublime, a concept linked to that of beauty, yielding a sense of greatness as a consequence of awareness of safety when confronted with danger. And in visual arts, one could say that Caspar David Friedrich is the best example. Oh, there it is. And I will now make you smell some sublimity. Some sublime smells. How do you feel about these smells? I can tell by your face. Yeah, you cannot hide it. These smells all contain sulfur. Sulfur is almost universally considered malodorous, stench. What did Balla mean with the importance of stench? And what did Burke mean? Well, when you smell something that reeks and you put it away, you feel a sense of relief. That's the sublime experience that Burke is talking about. And then the second historical example, Identity as Multisensory Concepts, an Olfactory Self-Portrait, Belle Haleine by Marcel Duchamp, 1921. I'm always amazed at how we connect the visual to our identity. When we see a picture of someone, we say, hey, that's that and that person. Even though we cannot smell that person, we cannot hear that person, whereas our smells are as unique as our fingerprints. They belong to our they're part of our identity. A few years after the birth of Balazs' Manifesto, one of the greatest avant-garde artists ever created one of his most famous ready-mades. Marcel Duchamp appropriated a bottle of Rigaud's Un air embaumé, air de violette, by adding a label and baptizing it Belle Haleine, air de voilette. The title is clearly a pun, the first part referring to both mouthwater and the classic beauty Helen of Troy, and the second to veiling water instead of violet water. A picture of Duchamp as his female alter ego Rose c'est la vie, phonetically Eros c'est la vie, Eros that's life, adorns the top of the label. In the picture by Man Ray, Duchamp presents himself as a woman by veiling himself with makeup and clothes. But how about the olfactory dimension? In our visually orientated society, where we are bombarded with digital images, we tend to forget that scent is closely linked to identity. Our body odor reveals information about age, health, our religious background, and gender. Some serious smelling going on in the corner. As Rose c'est la vie, Duchamp actually transforms into a woman on more than one level. Duchamp doesn't just veil his body odor, he veils his olfactory, masculine identity as well, just like he did with his visual self. And what better way to do that than with one of the most popular and seductively feminine contemporary perfumes? Although it must be said that its impact was partially due to the exotic and sensual advertisements, it was the fragrance itself that was part of the collective memory of generations to come. The perfume that was originally in this bottle was one of the most popular perfumes for decades, from the 20s until the 60s, in America and in France. And I worked with a perfumer to make an olfactory reconstruction of this original perfume. You can come to me afterwards. If you missed the smell, you can always ask me. So going to the final example. Dynesthesia and Surrealism, an international surrealist exhibition of 1938. All the surrealist exhibitions from 1938 until 1957 had a smell that was meant as an autonomous work of art, but was also cooperating with the other sensory stimuli. And this is a really interesting one. The first international surrealist exhibition. And this exhibition was all about dichotomies and about the five senses. So inside had to look as if it was outside. There are leaves on the floor. There are heavy coal bags hanging from the ceiling. They were actually filled with papers. It was completely darkened. Why? Because Duchamp, who designed this exhibition as a work of art, wanted to frustrate the sense of control. Sight is the sense of control. The Surrealists were interested in fragmentation, in the coincidence. How do you enhance this? By taking away sight and more exploring the other senses. Well, we all know these pictures, probably, but who knows what this exhibition actually smelled like? Does anyone know? This exhibition had the smell of Brazilian coffee. And that has a meaning. It's not meaningless. At the end of his life, Duchamp did an interview with Pierre Caban. And without being asked, he started talking about this smell. And he said there was this one wonderful aspect of this exhibition. It had a smell. The entire place smelled of coffee. And it was an autonomous work of art. No one really wrote about or analyzed this smell, but I think it had a meaning. It's Brazilian coffee. 1938 was the year the Brazilian group entered the Surrealist movement. And another thing, this was the first time the Surrealists moved to the salon. They were meeting in cafes, they arranged their own exhibitions, and here is their first exhibition in a salon. But the smell of their meeting place before they went exhibiting was coffee. They met in cafes. So the smell of the streets. I think that's why this smell is there. But also to create a sense of this place. To enhance the toevalligheid, coincidence. I brought some Brazilian coffee, so you can smell it if you like, if you're still up to smelling anything. Yeah, 1 minute left. That's good because I would like to conclude with this example. This topic is part of my PhD that I have just started. And I want to reconstruct a more sensory history of art with the smells that accompany it that accompany this history. And I'm working with a perfume company so that we can reconstruct all these smells on a more scientific level to make history of art more sensory, but also to lose this adjective visual art, because art can contain all the senses. That's it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Caro, for your presentation and performance. Let me call it performance. And should go right away into the question that you wanted to put to the audience about the first smell that we had, about the color? Is this maybe a start for a discussion?
Yes, I'm curious. What color did you associate with this smell? Green? Turquoise? Purple? Okay. Orange? Yellow, brown. Green. Brown, black, green. Of course, a smell doesn't just have one color. A smell is not like a color. A smell is like like colors in a composition. It has layers. It has perspective. It has forms. But most people associate this color with green. It's even called a green smell in perfumery.
Let's go actually and talk and gather our questions and comments. And from my point of view, I was surprised how fast, maybe then we can start with a statement when we discuss in the next few minutes the olfactory sensory perception. I was actually struck personally how I went disoriented being confronted with olfactory perception instead of vision, for instance, or the hearing right away with all these tests, or actually the examples of the European avant-garde in Italian and Dadaism, Surrealism. But maybe we just open up the forum right away, and are there comments or questions? Yeah, Paulina, please.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. It was, a pleasure to some extent. I was comparing the bed smells to some bed smells I know from Eastern Europe, and I thought, well, I don't know what the sublime, like, in any case, I'm going to leave this for another discussion. So my first question, I have a number of them. My first question is about the olfactory documentation. Do smells go bad? It's sort of a simple question. Like, can you lose it at some point? Does it go away? I mean, like, how do you actually preserve the smell?
Yeah, that is a huge problem. That is also one of the reasons that we've forgot about the olfactory dimension in history of art. Smell is volatile heritage. It's material heritage, but it's fleeting. You can preserve smells, first of all, by keeping them cool, by keeping them in a dark space, and always writing down the formula when they're liquids. I must say that most contemporary artists work with liquid smells because it's easier to control them.
My second question then, is it possible really to synthesize a smell of the past? That was the third question, but I just came up with it now. Because like you seem to want to do something, well, I believe something as ambitious as that, but is it possible to somehow, like how can you, are there, or maybe there are some formulae from the past that exist and then they can be reconstructed?
Yeah, one can reconstruct smells by using headspace technology. There's a Berlin-based artist, Sissel Tolaas, who does smell archaeology. She has her own mobile headspace machine and gas chromatographer, which are usually really big. So she puts like a cap in a corner of a room. She takes the molecules, analyzes them, and then you can smell, actually, things from, when you amplify them, you can smell things from the past.
Wow.
Yeah.
And my last question, so sometime in the future, I mean, I've taught a class before reading with your senses, and I've always had like a part on smell, and I've taught like one book that I've taught as perfume. So I was wondering what you would say about Zyskin's perfume. I mean, I've taught it a number of times. Have you thought about it at all? I mean, it's not our history, but it's just like an amazing example of this whole idea.
You mean the book?
The book, yeah, the Zyskin book. I mean, do you think you can consider it? You can use it in your work, or does it fall outside of your?
No, it's very important.
It's very important
because he, unlike most others, can link language to smell. It's incredibly difficult because smell is based in our olfactory bulb is in our primitive brain. It's very far apart from our linguistic area, so to speak. And we are not educated to use words for smells. And he knows how to do it. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I'll just leave it.
Yeah, we have a question over there and then here.
Yeah, so you were talking about this difference between the higher and the lower senses, and I was just thinking about the power of the lower senses, because in a lot of, I mean, I'm talking maybe more about literature because I don't know a lot about art, but it always appeared that the most long-lasting sensations, the one related to memory, are often sensation of the lower senses. I had to think about Marcel Proust and his experience of anamnesis through this little cake.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Are these lower senses really more powerful and long-lasting? I mean, do they leave more durable?
Oh yes, definitely.
Traces on the human body.
Smells can bring you back to the past, to your youth, when you didn't have words yet. Many memories are lingual, but sensory memories, especially olfactory memory and gustatory memory, are extremely strong. I think it's also about the physiology of the brain, because it's linked to your amygdala and your brainstem. So it's about emotion and memory. They're directly connected. Why? Because when I smell something that is dangerous, I have to link it to this emotion of fear. It's because that's safe, because that makes me survive. That's why smells and emotion are so closely linked. And that is why when I smell something that reminds me of the past, that memory comes back so vividly with all the emotions that were part of the memory. I published an article with Chrétien van Kampen on olfactory memories in art and science, and will be published in July in Senses and Society.
Yes, please.
Hello.
Hi.
In relation to, you had that question yesterday about in the state of sleep, what happens? And I was curious if you conducted any research on the sense of smell when one is dreaming. Something.
Yeah, that's a really intriguing question. I didn't do any research into it, but I'm working on it with a perfumer, and his hypothesis is, since smell is also linked to the subconscious, if you smell, that dreams are elicited by things you smelled during the day instead of things that you see during the day. And while we dream, we hear, but we also smell. So if you have a difficult task and you smell something at the same time, put that smell next to your bed. While you're sleeping, the smell will help you to get more creative solutions in the morning. It's a recent research by a sleep institute.
I have some comments myself at the moment. Talking about the Avant-Garde example that you showed, that brought me also to one exhibition we had at Art Laboratory Berlin, the third exhibition. It was the history of senses. And we had two British artists next door at our rooms, Caro and Simon Davenport, and they produced a special performance for Art Laboratory Berlin for Synesthesia series, and it was called the The Banquet for Ultra Bankruptcy. And it was a 6-course meal, 5 times repeated for each 6 people, and it was about 45 minutes. And they referred to Marinetti's manifesto of the futurist cuisine, cucina futurista. And it was completely a mix of senses. It was a completely olfactory feast, and it was also very disturbing. Now we're talking very much about the delightfulness of smell, but it can be also very unpleasant, disturbing torture. And they wanted to work a lot with Buttersäure. What is this in English? So in the end, they worked with saltpeter, which was also very acidy for the eyes. It was interesting. The whole room was blue, and people started to cough, and so I mean, they knew what would happen to them. Not that they would sign a contract that they would actually not sue us, but it was all provocative in the end. To taste, to touch, to smell, and they actually had a direct reference to the Avant-Garde.
Yeah, sounds nice.
We had another comment from Gerhard.
Short question only. It's possible that the coal bags in this exhibition were in fact coffee bags, and about the smell of coffee, of Brazilian
coffee.
Coffee?
It's a really smart remark. I've been reading and looking and searching for where did this smell come from, and then I found it in this Pierre Caban's interview. Duchamp explained how this smell was spread. It was coffee beans put on an electric heater.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, Please, here in the front. Yeah, oh. 1, 2, 3, please.
Yeah, it's interesting because most mammals have smell as the preferential sense. I think we're an exception, maybe from wandering the savannas and needing to see predators. But they're also, beyond the sense that we are conscious of, there are lots and lots of sense that we are not conscious of, but which kind of literally drag us around by the nose in our daily lives. And of course, industry is very well aware of this, using sense that we are conscious of and sense that we are not conscious of to make us buy things and so forth. Like every shopping mall or supermarket is full of this. But I was like, do you hear anybody working also with sense that we're not conscious of? Like
Oh yes. In neuromarketing, it is key, it is essential to create smells that are hardly perceivable, because then they do their job. You think there are no smells, but you perceive them unconsciously anyway, and they have their effect. Once you smell them, the effect is much less. Yeah.
Also, how about among artists using?
No, I know no artist who uses a smell. That's a really good point. But maybe I don't know it because I didn't know that there was a smell. Oh, I know one artist who used pheromones. Of course, you cannot smell them, but you perceive them with your olfactory bulb. And he would study the people visiting his pheromone work. He didn't tell anyone that he used them. What he noticed is that people lingered. They stayed there longer than in front of other works of art. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think for the time we just have these 2 questions and then we go on to the 3rd presentation.
Thanks for your talk. It was really fascinating. I'm not sure I have exactly a question, but just on after that one, I think the artist Usman Hack has used smells in installations, so he might be interesting to look at. But I was just really struck by some of the things that you said and similarity between smell and sound. I'd never really thought about it, the very primitive aspect of it, that a lot of the stuff discussed about smell in your talk seemed to be connected to vision, and whether that's just always the dominant thing with smell, the way in which you describe it is color or looking at a picture or something like this.
Yeah.
But I was really struck by the fact that there's so many similarities. Like we can't switch off our ears, we can't switch off our noses, but we can close our eyes, and
Yes.
we can smell things behind us. The kind of borders and territories that sound and smell can cross are very similar. But
there are a lot of similarities between smell and hearing. Actually, most of the words that are used in perfumery are taken from music. Every perfume has tones, notes, bass notes, hard notes, and top notes, and they speak of accords. So yes.
You mentioned that body odor has become a taboo. Oh, it happened 150 years ago. What happened 150 years ago? And perfumes were used before 150 years.
Yes.
Didn't they serve to hide body odor?
Yeah, hide body odor, but right now we deodorize first and then odorize. So first we take away all of our body odor, and then we use body odors of animals like musk, civet, amber to mask our own body odor. What happened about 150 years ago is that lower classes started to use soap. There was a hygienic movement, city planning happened in a way that there were as little smells as possible. Bad smells were excluded from the city centers. Sewers were started to be built under the ground. Yeah.
Okay, Caro, I think we have to come to an end here. Thank you so much for your presentation.